The Centre presents a new podcast, CBME and You, a podcast devoted to promoting awareness and debate around controversial ethical issues in biomedicine.
Welcome back to CB Me and You, a podcast about biomedical ethics. Today, we discuss public patient involvement in health research. Should the public be involved in saying what we should be researching? And what kind of shenanigans will occur when this happens? Joining us today is Lucy Frith, professor at the Centre for Social Ethics and Policy at the University of Manchester. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you. We are so excited to have you here. We're going to begin with our three favourite questions. And given that you've just tried it for the first time, coffee or copy?
I think copy.
Really?
Yeah.
That's
I
a
like
quick
it.
convert.
Yeah. It's nice and strong.
Just hits you in the face with the flavour.
Yeah.
It has sweetened condensed milk in it, which I adore. I think it's much better than sugar. It's like sugary sugar.
Yeah, because it's so much more powerful.
What hits you in the face
Just
with the
pile
flavour?
on those calories. Good stuff.
Shh. We don't need to hear about that.
Sorry, you just tried it. I should let you enjoy it properly before giving you the bad news.
I don't mind it.
One time, someone told me that you can't drink calories. Like, that's not how science works. And I'm here to pass on that information.
Okay, right.
You can't drink calories.
Well, as a baby, my mum used to give me carnation milk, which is a UK brand of condensed milk, an egg white.
Delicious. I say bring it back. No calories.
Like in the same drink?
I don't think so, but child rearing practices have changed.
Sounds like a child's cocktail. You know, like get the egg foam, condensed milk.
It sounds like something that they give you to get rid of a hangover.
Yeah, actually.
Have your condensed milk and egg white.
No, not together, like egg white and then...
Oh, so one shot.
Yeah, I presume. I was a baby, I don't know. Probably why I've got bad teeth.
Yeah, chaser of egg white.
Anyway, moving on to the next question. What country would you like to travel to the most next?
Well, I'm going to Lisbon in a few weeks, so I'm going to say Lisbon in Portugal.
Oh, that's
So I'm
beautiful.
looking forward to that.
It's winter there at the moment?
Spring, hopefully.
Spring. Oh,
Hopefully.
beautiful.
Should
It
be
looks
spring
so
in the UK
colourful
soon.
there.
Yeah.
So you haven't been before?
I have been before, but we're staying at a very nice hotel, so I'm quite excited about that.
Excellent. So the hotel, not necessarily Lisbon.
Well, both, I think.
Yeah, I do get excited about the possibility of staying in a nice hotel because most of the time when I travel, I'm staying in like budget hostels and stuff.
YMCAs.
Yeah. So when you do get the chance to stay in a nice hotel, well.
It doesn't leave.
Where's
Yeah.
the robe?
Yeah, I've been there, done that. I only go to nice hotels now.
Good for you. Our third and final question for this part. What song would you sing at karaoke?
Okay, well, I'm going to be very cheesy and say I Will Survive.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's not cheesy at all. It's a
End
classic.
of night song, I think.
When
When you've
had multiple drinks.
you've bedded into the experience. And then you go home and cry.
And next day, you're like, oh, I hope my friends never see me again.
You get an unsolicited clip of you singing it and you're like, I really thought I hit that note.
No, with no expectation of hitting any notes at all.
I think that's the best thing to do, to go in with no expectations.
100%.
Okay, serious questions. Now, the first question is your basic, what is this kind of question? So when I think of public involvement in health research, I almost imagine a panel of randoms just deciding whether we should fund cancer research or not. And that worries me, a panel of randoms deciding my future. So could you tell us a little bit more about what is public patient involvement in health research and what you have in mind when you talk about that?
Okay, well, I think that's a good question because it's lots of things. So that I think it can be a panel of people deciding on what we should fund in terms of research. So in the UK, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence did have some citizens panels that did decide on, helped people make decisions on what drugs should be prescribed and the evidence and so on. But it can also be at the level of the research project. So in a way, it can be anything from very high level policy right down to involvement in a specific clinical trial or specific research project. So it's a very, very broad area. So I think that's the first thing I think I was trying to stress in my talk, was that when we talk about public involvement, we can mean all sorts of different things in different situations. So it's really important to be clear about exactly what kind of thing we're talking about, and then different criticisms might pertain to different situations and different justifications.
So we've got straight in my brain, I was like, oh, clinical trials. Of course we need the public for these sorts of things. And then you just said that we had the public advising on whether or not we should prescribe certain drugs based on evidence. And it sounds like a jury. And are they qualified to be making these decisions? Like how, when you're talking about that policy level, how informed are they?
Well, that's an interesting point. But of course, juries are meant to be the classic. Now I'm in a law department and getting involved in sort of reading the law and things. There's a lot of reasonable men in law. You know, you hear the reasonable man on the Clapham omnibus, and you know, it's very. I'm sure they mean person, or maybe they didn't. But in a way, a jury is meant to be a reasonable person who has no particular dog in the fight, if you like, an impartial panel of people who will listen to the evidence and weigh up if someone's guilty. So you don't pick criminal juries or juries in trials for expertise. I mean, and that's one of the problems of very complicated financial trials, for example. You know, juries aren't expert, might get a bit lost. So I think the idea is with citizens' juries at that level of policy is that they are a person in the street, and you present evidence to them, and they help weigh it up. And they may be part of the decision-making process, not the whole decision-making process. So they may be part of the things that the committee will ultimately bring to bear on the decision.
Okay, so in your research on this kind of public patient involvement, I guess part of it is to try to disambiguate and clarify these different issues and the different ways in which the public can get involved. Do you have a particular dog in this race? Do you have like an opinion on like, okay, we based on my research, these are the ones that we want to focus on, and these are the good ones, and there's some others that are a little harder to get going?
I think yes and no. I think there's a lot of good arguments of why we might want people involved at policy level. Just generally, you know, democratic presumptions in society that we think we should involve people. But then it's a very different beast at the level of, let's say, for sake of argument, a clinical trial, where you might have more patients than public. So the people who are involved might be people who are, you know, affected by the condition you're studying or in the situation you're trying to unpack. And then there might be different kinds of imperatives, like them bringing their expertise and helping you as the researcher understand the condition more. So I think it's working out where it's appropriate, and also within that individual setup, how you organise it so that I think you get a balance of opinions, that you don't swing too much in one direction or the other. So I think traditionally health medical research has been very hierarchical, highly weighted on expertise. I mean, if you think about the rise of evidence-based medicine, we've moved from sort of clinical considered opinion of what the consultant said and had always done, to trying to think about employing research in practice. So in a way, that's almost a form of opening up clinical decision-making. So you might think it's a good thing that we move away from just thinking about what medics might be interested in, scientists might be interested in, and also trying to bring in what patients might be interested in. Because I think with research, there's a lot of... and so you get this in bioethics research. There's certain topics that are really interesting philosophically, say like the status of the fetus. I mean, for the JME, we get loads of articles about that because it's an interesting philosophical topic, the ontology, all that. But practically, there's probably not a lot, Whereas there's other topics that are much more practically important, but much less philosophically interesting. So it depends what you're trying to do the research for. And I'm not saying either one is better or worse. It's just that you might be motivated to say something important philosophically, and that would be one kind of study, or you might be motivated to make a big practical difference, say with abortion care, and that probably wouldn't be talking about the status of the fetus. You might want to look at support services and have women access them and so on. So you might say that's true with medical research, that rather than thinking what's scientifically interesting, although, with clinical research, maybe we need to focus more on what in people experiencing healthcare actually need and want, rather than what scientists might think is interesting. And they might pull in, they don't always, but they could pull in different directions.
Yeah, so in any given case, I guess there are a few different, levers that we can pull on that will change the nature of the kind of citizen panel or public patient involvement. As you mentioned, it can differ at the kind of level of discussion. I guess you could imagine panels on like every single research a panel or whether every single ethical panel deciding whether something should be funded or not, or it could be at a higher level and a more general, should we fund this kind of research in general? And then another lever is like who we're getting on the panel. Is it patients and their families, or random people in the street?
These random people again.
Yeah, I love the random people. So I'm wondering if you could like paint a bit of use an example to paint a picture of how we might decide in a given situation, how we should adjust these different levers.
Yeah, I think, there's an interesting question about who we get to involve per se. I think at the level of, in England, there is a statutory requirement that healthcare bodies involve the public in some way to get feedback. Quite how much that's done and how rigorously is a different kettle of fish. But there's a sense that that's a good thing to do, that the NHS has always grappled with this, trying to be, even though the English is the English NHS, not UK. Struggle with being either a national or a very regional organisation, and it's flip-flopped over the years. And that the idea of having these regional sort of commissioning bodies is that you're responsive to your local community. So if you have a very ethnically diverse community, you tailor your services. If you have a very old community, you'd be wanting different kinds of services. So I think in one level you could say the NHS has always tried to involve the public in some way in how it distributes or what it commissions at quite a broad level. I think recently in research we've seen the rise of patients involved in specific research projects. They're also involved on grant panels. So for NIHR, you often have a public contributor on the research panel, and they'll give you the public contributor review you get. So you get 5 or 6 reviews from the academics they've asked to review it, and then the public contributor reviewer. So that for the NIHR, that's how they distribute funding. So that's very embedded. And then at the project level, you might, depending on your project, get some people from who might you see as aiming to speak for the people with, if you're doing a trial on asthma, you might want people who are asthma sufferers or carers of asthma sufferers or carers and so on. So I don't quite sure if that answers your question. But I think because there's all these different levels and different ways you can involve broadly these lay people, I think it is quite hard to pin down.
I would like to just play devil's advocate for a second, and this is a position new to me. This is usually James's job to be devil's advocate.
Well, I'm always so friendly. Every single guest, I'm like, no, you're completely right. No more questions.
You've convinced me. I have no further questions. So just one concern that someone might have about public involvement and is this idea that experts alone are not charged with making value-laden decisions. So that's a quote from your excellent paper, which I enjoyed. And I just want to ask, is that for the best? If we are taking a space away from an expert who has been trained in that particular field, who knows that literature back to front, who has dedicated their life to making these sorts of decisions, what can involving the public add to these really controversial and difficult decisions?
Well, I suppose the argument would be there that no one is, be careful what I say now, no one is an expert in the values in a sense. I mean, obviously as bioethicists, we like to think we are.
So sensitive.
So I'll just
Tiptoe around that one.
resign from my job now.
Don't make us lose our jobs now.
But I suppose in a sense, although we might be experts in one way of thinking about values, it doesn't mean that our moral opinion is any better than anyone else's. So if we went to the 7-Eleven and got the 8 people standing in there, seems to be a reasonable number of people standing at 7-Eleven regularly, so we seem packed, and we got them in here, there'd be no, I don't think it would be reasonable to suggest that we were more, that our views on values were any better than theirs. We might be able to articulate them and talk about Plato and Mill or whoever we wanted to talk about. But ultimately, you might say, well, their value judgments are just as valid as ours. We don't have any particular, arguably, I mean, there is different views of ethical expertise, but you could say we don't have a privileged position. We're not the sort of priests, if you like, here to say this is right and therefore you should follow us. So I suppose in that sense, you could quite easily make an argument that values are one thing, but medical expertise is another. So while the doctor might know about the evidence for a particular treatment, they might not know if that's the right treatment for that person in that situation or for society, for instance. So what I'm doing in Lisbon is talking about germline therapy. So I'm going after someone who's a scientist, an expert in this and does embryo gene editing. Now, obviously, they know loads more about, well, they could probably do it. I couldn't do it. But I don't think just because they have and that's because they know they're a scientist involved in that, they have any greater or lesser appreciation of the ethics than you or I do. So in that sense, I'm a lay person because I'm not a scientist, but I think I can contribute to discussing the values if they explain the science to me. And you could always explain in broad brushes the science to people, I think. But that takes time and is often difficult, but I think you can do it. I think it's quite easy to go, people won't understand, but people make lots of complicated decisions all the time. And some people might think are happy to trust professionals with that, and that's also okay.
You say we're not priests, but the gown that I wore for my graduation disagrees with that.
Okay.
I felt very priestly.
He looked very priestly.
True. Yeah, they can do. Is it red?
It was black with a blue thingy.
Okay.
I don't even know the names of those things.
Hood?
Hood, yeah.
A Robin Hood.
Yeah, well, let's just call it a cape because that sounds cool.
Okay.
So bringing back what you were saying is that the public does have moral standing. In law, we talk about who has standing to be involved in a particular decision, and those outside that who don't have standing, well, they have no weight to bring this matter before a court of law. And so what you are saying is that in matters of particularly public health, in which we are all impacted by these decisions and in which we all have experience in making controversial and ethical decisions, the public does have moral standing and should be included. Do you think there are limits to this?
Well, I think there are practical limits. I mean, I suppose it's where you sort of draw the levels, isn't it? Because arguably you could say in the UK, we've had an election relatively recently, parties talked about the NHS. You could say at one level, people vote for the kind of health system they want. Obviously, that's one bit of many decisions you make when voting for a political party. So you could say a party, that there's a sort of democratic buy-in to that kind of position on the NHS from the government, because that has to be the democratic process. Now you can argue that it's not, because lots of people don't vote. It's one issue amongst many, but in a way that is how sort of a Western liberal democracy works. You have to sort of can't faffle about too much with that. But I suppose so for instance, the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, which deals with things like embryo editing and reproductive technologies, they've had various public consultations over the years since they were established in 91. And so when they did the mitochondrial DNA transfer consultation, they went around the country, they did open meetings, they talked to people, they organised events, and but you don't get a huge buy-in. One public consultation they had got 200 responses. Well, that's from a nation of, I don't know, how many people live in Britain? 60 million? Roughly.
At least 3.
At least, yeah. So that's not a lot of people, is it? Responding, 200 people, that's a teeny tiny number. So you can say, well, but at least they've been asked. The fact they went, I don't care, that's fine. In a way, you can't force people to be involved. And quite often, the NHS regularly sends out surveys and people don't answer them. And with student evaluations, you send out and they don't bother replying. And partly you think, well, that must mean you're reasonably happy. Or maybe not. But, you can't force people to engage. Sometimes people don't want to be doing it. So I think it's the levels of that. So I don't think we're in danger of a sort of populist overwhelm of medical expertise, because I don't think there's enough people with sufficient passion about it to be involved in a lot of things. But then on the other hand, there are issues like abortion where you do see a huge popularist. That's not medical research, although people do object to medical research on embryos and so on. So I think it depends on the issue, but I think generally we're not at a kind of overwhelm of the public.
My next question
involved.
was going to be about that idea that simply because the majority of people think it's a good idea doesn't mean it is a good idea.
No.
But your practical response to that is, well, I just don't think a majority are responding. So that's not really an issue.
But this does make me realize, I just thought of this, it does make me realize that this might be make it vulnerable a little bit to certain kinds of sudden takeovers by certain kinds of special interest groups or minorities. I can't think of any specific cases right now, but I'm pretty sure I've seen it now and then. You have some kind of case or some kind of issue that we've been working on for a very long time, and academics or professionals have kind of been working on it with no issue, and there's some kind of access to public access to it, but nobody really cares. But then some group somewhere realizes, hey, we can actually really change things by taking over, and suddenly they come in a drove and just mess the whole thing up, or by their lights change it for the better. So
hearing some judgment here.
There is. It seems to me that what you're proposing does leave that kind of vulnerability.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't deny that. I think you're right. And there have been cases of, particularly around the NICE deliberations, because there was a special cancer fund for very expensive cancer drugs was set up quite a while ago now. And my colleague Rachel Baker, who's a health economist, did some really interesting work about priority setting around that. And of course, say at the level of, say, NICE's deliberations about certain drugs, there were very vocal patient groups, particularly, this is going back a lot, 20 odd years, but a drug for multiple sclerosis, the patient association was very much lobbying and pushing for a particular drug. I can't remember what it was. And this patient group was funded by the drug company who produced the drug. So some patient groups with conditions that are, have amenable to very expensive drugs, are often supported by drug companies. And therefore you could say is that becomes a sort of pressure group who are campaigning for these certain drugs. And that seems to be a case where that seems to step beyond that idea of involving the lay person. You suddenly get these quite big pressure groups and they might have a disproportionate influence. But I think with those things, I mean, in NICE's setup, it was always one part of the equation. And I think that's having the balance that you take it as a whole, that one element is not going to overwhelm the whole decision-making process. So you might take, a very simple example, you manage to get everyone in the UK and they vote for something, like they have a referendum. I mean, the Irish didn't they, on abortion a few years ago. And you get it, like Brexit, you could say you take a referendum, you get the wrong decision, and you might think, we're going to ignore that. Although that's quite hard. Switzerland does this, has a lot of referendums on issues that are quite granular. So, I think in my lifetime there's only been one referendum in the UK, and that was on Europe. We don't have referendums on medical research, but have a look at Switzerland, because I can't remember any examples, but they do have quite granular referendums and they ask everybody on particular topics. But I think if you have it as part of the decision making, then you do have some checks and balances, that it's not just, well, the public think this. And you're right, you need to decide where you want to bring in democracy, because we did with the referendum on Europe, but you might not on other things. So
you think it's both important to involve the public for the idea that, well, you were involved in this decision, it's a democracy, we considered your opinion, and maybe that in itself satisfies certain portions of the public because they felt included. Even if they're not happy with the outcome, they were at least involved.
Yeah.
But then surely it's not just like a tokenistic, we involved you, but we're going to ignore everything that you said, even though sometimes it might be necessary, particularly if you do have those extremely passionate, disproportionate, radicalized groups. But all in all, is there research that shows that involving the public in these sorts of decisions actually improves healthcare outcomes or has other practical consequences?
Well, at the level of research studies, there is some evidence that it does improve research outcomes, and it improves uptake of the research findings and so on, and improves dissemination. Yeah. At a policy level, there have been consultations the government did, and, the public, well, the tiny little bit of the public who responded were for something, and it was completely ignored and they changed the law anyway. So I think it's always Parliament at the level of legislative change will always take the decision, even in the face of having these small consultations. But I think there's all these different levels. So at big policy decisions, that's one kind of set of considerations. And then at the level of research studies, there's very different ones. So you might want to, for just practical reasons, have a lay group where you're, making suggestions for how things might work, getting their feedback, seeing what symptoms are most troubling to them, having a sense of the lived experience of the condition that can help you develop the treatment or the drug and make it more responsive to the needs of the community.
It seems like the more narrow the healthcare research topic, the greater incentive there would be to involve public involvement, because the advice they provide will be so much more granular and specific and outcome oriented. But then, as you were saying, when you have those big moral philosophical questions of, should we permit abortion, should we not permit abortion, is that always going to be useful, particularly in pluralist societies where you can just have permissive rather than like mandatory or prohibitive legislation? Do you have any comment about that?
Well, I suppose with those big issues, Yeah, I suppose, I mean, in the UK, the law does, for certain things tries to let, like with abortion, allows you to make your own decision about that within certain limits up to 24 weeks, I think, is it? I don't know.
I haven't checked in a while.
Yeah. But, within pretty broad parameters and the accepting that if you don't want to be involved in that, we have a conscientious objection clause. So if you're a healthcare professional, you don't have to work in those services. Obviously, as an individual, you don't have to have one. So it's seen as that's something you can make your own moral decisions about. But obviously, that's a moral decision in itself, because we don't allow you to make your own moral decision about murdering people. So that's obviously already...
There are limits, people.
Well, that's already putting it in a category of, you can do that if you wish or not. So that's already saying the state will allow that and leave it up to individual conscience. So I suppose for those really big moral decisions, you would be thinking about, like, for instance, the assisted dying bill is going through Parliament now, and that's being debated. There hasn't been a referendum, but it's gone through the sort of parliamentary process. People can submit evidence. They're looking, they're taking evidence from patient groups and all sorts of different, and academics. One of my colleagues has just been at Parliament talking to them about her research. So that becomes, I suppose, that sort of almost, that parliamentary deliberative process where you can lobby your MP. That's just kind of, a work, that's sort of democracy. You might be having the same debate about, well, the runway. The government want a new runway at Heathrow, and a similar, probably more. When you will start saying, do people want that? Is that something we want as a society to encourage air travel? So I think at that level, there's quite well-worn paths for involving people, and there are dangers, but then, as Winston Churchill said, democracy is not a great system, but it is the best one there is. It's not perfect, there's a lot of problems, but it is generally better than anything else. But at the level of research studies, you might say, is that the kind of area where we should even be trying to have some democratic imperative? Because we've got our medical experts, we've got all the trialists, the stats people. What are those lay people actually bringing?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the involvement of the public in certain ethical, controversial decisions in healthcare can really be a great way to just get through the decision that we have to make. And I think sometimes we like to sit in our chairs in this office and just chat about, oh, this is a great idea, or this is a great idea. But at the end of the day, a decision has to be made, healthcare has to be provided, or it has to not be provided. So I like that idea of using the public as a way to gauge where most people sit on a particular spectrum, and like the closer you have to get like a really strong disagreement, like such as 50-50 between pro and anti-abortion, well then that's when we know we need permissive legislation. But then if you have a really strong consensus on a particular issue, that's also really helpful. And I think that we shouldn't gatekeep these ethical decisions from the people who are honestly most affected by them. But so I've been pushing you with some questions during this podcast, but I actually agree with you.
Really playing the devil's advocate there.
I'm really proud of myself. I learned a new skill. XP unlocked.
So you mentioned a bit earlier that one issue is that many people don't attend these things. And short of probably making it compulsory, a lot of people will never attend these things unless they're the kinds of issues that really animate people and really get them going, like abortion or something like that. And even then, you might only get if you were to do a referendum on abortion, you might get 40 or 50% of the population. And I suspect that in many of these cases, the representation might be a little disproportionate. You might have a lot of people who have more time on their hands or who are more tuned into these issues. And often this leaves out people who are minorities and people of lower socioeconomic statuses. So is there some way to remedy and address these issues?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think I presented an example. I think one of your questions was about examples that I was involved in a big NIHR infrastructure grant. And it was for very applied research, but medical, sort of clinical, but applied. And we had a group of public advisors who were on the management committee of the grant, were very involved in all the decision-making structures. And they were a group of people who were very diverse. We'd made, me and my predecessor and the team, it wasn't just me, made a great effort to recruit people, bring them on board, nurture them, say train them, but support them in being able to work with us on the grant. And I think that takes a lot of work, but I think it is possible, because one of the criticisms is, in a UK context, you tend to get lots of middle class, white, retired professionals who are articulate, able, financially independent because they've retired in the days when professionals have good pensions. Obviously, that will change as we go forward.
What was that
Looking
like?
forward to it.
Yeah, but at the retirees at the moment, so you get, the sort of classic school teacher, people who are, and therefore you're not getting a diverse group. And in a way, you're almost getting people very much like the researchers. So you're not kind of broadening that epistemic pool. It's just kind of more of the same, but just a bit older. And I think there is a tension in that, because obviously, as you said earlier, people need to know enough to be able to make comments about things. Because if you know nothing about something, you can't really make useful critiques, can you? If I gave you if you're biochemist experts, apologies, but a scientific subject you know nothing about and said, here's a journal article, review that for me. I wouldn't be able to comment intelligently on a biochemistry paper because I don't know enough of it. Well, I don't know anything about it. So you could ask me, but so you need to give people enough knowledge, but then the criticism is then they become experts. So you're losing their raw leanness. But that's not a word, but
The umami.
yeah,
The wok.
Mouthfeel.
yeah. That thing we want, that kind of thing we want to get out of them. And I think there's an element of truth in that. But then in the other hand, with the ARC, because that was the project, we had so many people, and they did become kind of experts in this form of participation, but that did enable them to make a big contribution. But again, I think there was the balance of they were part of the team, not. I think sometimes you can get, in any group, dominant people who tend to drive the decisions. And I think if you try and have where everyone can put their decision in is valued and heard, I think if it swings too far one way or the other, because I have been in meetings with very dominant clinicians. I know, who'd have
So many words were unspoken just then.
Man, I wish the viewers could sometimes see a video of us talking.
Yeah.
You should have seen the look on Lucy's face just then. It's like,
that was a go figure look. But but obviously, but I've also been in situations where they've been very dominant public contributors, and you feel that they're railroading people. And so I suppose, one of the themes in my work, I suppose, is that it's important to think about process. Process is very important and does a really important job in decision making. It's not just a sort of administrative nicety. That good process does produce better ethical decisions, and I don't really have time to justify that claim, but
We'll take you for it.
yeah, just accept it. There's a lot of literature on it that I mention in various things I've written. So I think it's important that you have that. I was on an NHS priority setting committee, and the person who chaired that, Nick Partridge, was the most amazing chair Sir Nick Partridge, I think he is, I've ever come across. And he was someone who could bring everyone, pick out the views, bring it all together, summarise it, and really, you felt at the end of it that the group had made the decision, didn't allow one person or one group of people to dominate. So I think in an ideal sense, any kind of decision that has that tries to reach some form of not consensus, because you might not get agreement, but the agreement to do what we're doing, recognising that not everyone might be on board with it.
I would follow a Sir Partridge. It's the sound of it. I'm Sir Partridge. Oh, you know what?
I'll follow you into battle, Sir Partridge.
So the idea of you brought up the idea of like how we need to educate people. Sometimes you bring as many people in, even those who don't really know about the issue and are not really educated in it themselves, and try to educate them. And this leaves us quite a lot of power, I guess, in the hands of the person doing the educating, because sometimes the decisions on how to educate are also not value neutral, and there are also a lot of issues. You can try to, for example, if you give them the information best that you know how, on one, it might look like you're leading them in a certain direction. And on the other hand, if you try to give a so-called balanced description of the issues, that has its own issues. So, for example, I was in Australia a couple of years ago when there was a certain referendum on an issue, and the government sent out a whole bunch of like little booklets on like reasons to vote yes or reasons to vote no.
Okay.
I was looking at it and thinking, well, these reasons are not the same. There's some reasons here which are clearly better than others. So I guess there are a whole bunch of issues in trying to educate people on how to think about an issue. And I'm wondering if there are ways to do that in better or more neutral ways.
Arguably, I suppose you can never really be neutral, can you, with information giving? I mean, citizens' juries are set up to try and give the pros and cons, but I don't think you'd probably ever be able to say that's completely unbiased, because ways of putting things. But I think in research projects, it's more just giving them enough so that they can assess things themselves and come to their own opinions. It's not, and it's not always about making big decisions. It's just having input and giving a bit more context, or explaining why they think, a certain treatment regime wouldn't work, for instance. And, there's a great history of, do-gooders doing things for people less fortunate than them that the people didn't want or didn't need or couldn't use. So I think involving people in decisions about them can help the things you're trying to develop be more applicable for them. So it might simply be saying, well, one of the things, with COVID, when we were trying to involve people, was really simple things like not everyone had a laptop or a computer. And, as an academic, I've, lots of people access information just on their phone. Now, that's not rocket science, and I'm not claiming that's... But actually them saying, don't give me all these PDFs because I find them really hard to read on my phone, and making sure all our documents were optimised for mobile phones meant they could actually read them properly. And that's something, those terrible, unaccessible PDFs in columns that people give out, and journal articles formatted like that you shouldn't do anymore because it's inaccessible. It's very hard to read that on a mobile phone. Now, a lot of professionals don't only access content on mobile phones, but a lot of other people don't have a laptop. So that's not particularly profound, but that stops someone reading something easily.
I think that we do not have time for more today. I know that you are a very busy person. I think that, to summarize, I really like you quoting Winston Churchill for many reasons. But I like that idea that, democracy, it's not a perfect solution, but it's the best we've got. And I'm happy with the defense of that.
Yeah, I think we have to be pragmatic. I think when you start saying, yes, there'll be bias, yes, there'll be interest, yes, there'll be things won't be perfect, but we have to do what we can with the resources we can, and sometimes something is better than nothing. And at least if we're, And I think that's what I was saying at the end of the paper, was at least if we're trying to move in a certain direction, we might never get to that golden point because, we've been having democratic elections. Well, not actually that long, only from that.
Or as long as human history.
Another podcast.
No, actually, because women didn't get the vote till after the First World War. So arguably not that long, in fact, but for a reasonable amount of time. And it's not perfect, but you'll try. Well, I would like to say we are trying to move in direction, although globally we seem not to be. But that's a different kettle of fish.
Doing our best.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much for coming on the
Thank
pod
you.
today.
Well, thank you.
We look forward to your talk next week.
On a different topic.
On a different topic, and take care.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to our new podcast. Subscribe online and tune in every first of the month. In the meantime, listen to CBME and you, and be savvy.